They laughed before he even finished his sentence. It started as a few quiet chuckles, people shifting in their seats, exchanging looks that said, "Is he serious?" Then the laughter grew louder, heavier, until it filled the room and swallowed his words whole. He stood there frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, heart pounding so hard it felt like everyone could hear it. All he had done was speak his dream out loud. The room wasn't fancy. The walls were dull, the chairs old, the air thick with impatience. People were there to be practical, to talk about safe plans and predictable futures. And then there was him, thin, nervous, wearing shoes that had seen better days, talking about becoming something more. Something bigger. Something no one expected from a boy like him. "Be realistic," someone said, shaking their head. "People like you don't do things like that," another added. A third laughed the loudest and said, "Dreams don't pay bills." Each word landed like a stone. He nodded slowly, pretending he understood. Pretending it didn't hurt. Pretending he wasn't shrinking inside. He kept his eyes down because if he looked up, they'd see the truth, how badly he wanted this, how much it mattered, how fragile his hope really was. When it was over, people filed out, still smiling, still amused. They forgot him before they even reached the door. To them, he was just another name, another unrealistic idea, another story that would never go anywhere. But to him, that moment carved itself into his memory. He walked home alone. The streets were loud, but his mind was louder. Every laugh replayed again and again. Every doubtful look echoed in his head. With each step, his confidence faded a little more. By the time he reached his small, dimly lit room, the dream felt foolish, almost embarrassing. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor. Maybe they were right. He didn't have connections. He didn't have money. He didn't even have someone who believed in him. The world had already decided who he was supposed to be, and it wasn't someone who chased dreams. It was someone who survived. Someone who settled. Someone who stayed quiet. He lay back and closed his eyes, hoping sleep would silence his thoughts. But it didn't. Instead, memories came rushing in every time someone told him he wasn't enough, every time he was overlooked, every time he had to grow up faster than he should have. Still, beneath all that noise, something stubborn refused to die. A small voice. Quiet. Tired. But still there. What if they're wrong? He sat up again, breathing slowly. His room was dark, but the window let in a thin line of moonlight. He looked at his hands that had worked hard, hands that had never been praised, hands that were always underestimated. "These hands can build something," he whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud. No one heard him. No one applauded. No one laughed. And for the first time that day, that felt okay. He reached for an old notebook tucked beneath his pillow. The pages were creased, the cover worn. Inside were thoughts he'd never shared, ideas he was afraid to say out loud. Dreams he'd been told were too big for someone like him. He opened it and wrote one sentence. "One day, they will understand." He stared at the words for a long time. They didn't magically fix anything. His problems didn't disappear. Tomorrow would still be hard. People would still doubt him. But that sentence became an anchor. That night, he made a quiet promise, not to them, not to the world, but to himself. He didn't promise success. He didn't promise fame. He didn't promise an easy path. He promised effort. He promised persistence. He promised that no matter how often he was laughed at, he wouldn't laugh at his own dreams. As the night deepened, the laughter from earlier felt distant. Still painful but weaker. Because for the first time, he understood something important. Dreams don't need permission. They don't need applause. They only need someone brave enough to believe in them when no one else will. And though the world had laughed that day, Somewhere in the quiet of a small room, a dream had just been born. Morning came without mercy. The alarm rang, sharp and impatient, pulling him out of a sleep that had never really settled. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, hoping the weight in his chest would lift. It didn't. The laughter from that room returned instantly, as clear as if it had happened only seconds ago. He got up anyway. There was no time to feel sorry for himself. There never was. Life had taught him that early. He washed his face with cold water, put on the same worn clothes, and stepped outside into a world that expected nothing from him and offered even less. The days blurred together after that. He tried. That was the part no one saw. After long hours of work, when his body begged for rest, he stayed up learning, practicing, writing, failing. Some nights he barely slept at all. Other nights, he stared at his notebook until the words blurred, wondering if he was chasing something that would never catch him back. The doubts grew louder with time. Be realistic. You're wasting your energy. Why can't you just be normal? The voices weren't always from other people anymore. Slowly, they became his own. He sent messages that went unanswered. Applications that were ignored. Ideas that were dismissed without explanation. Every rejection chipped away at his belief, turning confidence into something fragile and thin. One evening, he visited an old friend. They sat together in silence for a while, the air heavy with things unsaid. Finally, the friend asked, "So, are you still trying for that dream?" He nodded. The friend sighed. "You know I care about you. But don't you think it's time to let it go? You've been struggling for so long. Maybe it's not meant for you." The words weren't cruel. That almost made them worse. He forced a smile and said nothing. What could he say? That giving up felt like losing a part of himself? That the dream was the only thing keeping him moving forward? On the walk home, doubt wrapped around him like a shadow. Maybe effort wasn't enough. Maybe belief wasn't enough. Maybe dreams really were only for certain people. That night, he sat on the floor of his room, his back against the wall. His notebook lay open in front of him, its pages filled with crossed-out plans and unfinished thoughts. For the first time, he considered closing it for good. "What's the point?" he whispered. Tears came before he could stop them. Quiet ones. The kind that don't make a sound but still hurt just as much. He wasn't crying because it was hard. He was crying because he was tired of hoping, tired of trying, tired of believing alone. He thought about his family. Their sacrifices. Their expectations. They never told him directly to stop, but their silence said enough. They worried about him. About his future. About how long he could keep chasing something uncertain. "You need stability," they said. "A steady life. Something safe." Safe. The word felt heavy. Safety meant letting go of the dream. It meant choosing a path that wouldn't embarrass him, wouldn't invite laughter, wouldn't require explaining himself again and again. He closed his notebook. For a long time, he just sat there, listening to the quiet. The world didn't collapse. Nothing dramatic happened. Life simply continued, indifferent to his struggle. That scared him more than anything. But then his eyes fell on a sentence written on the first page, faded but still clear. "One day, they will understand." He swallowed hard. He remembered the night he wrote it, the loneliness, the fear, the stubborn spark of hope he had refused to extinguish. He remembered the promise he made to himself, when no one else was watching. He opened the notebook again. The doubt didn't disappear. It stayed, lingering at the edges of his mind. But something shifted. Instead of letting it crush him, he let it sit beside him, acknowledged but not in control. He wrote again, his hand shaking slightly. "Even if they never understand, I still have to try." The words weren't confident. They weren't bold. But they were honest. The next day, he woke up tired, but determined. He faced more rejection. More silence. More moments where quitting felt easier than continuing. But he kept going. Not because he was fearless. Not because he was certain of success. But because giving up would have hurt more than failing. Doubt walked with him every step of the way. It whispered that he wasn't good enough, that time was running out, that the world wasn't waiting for him. And yet, beneath all that noise, his dream still breathed. Weak. Wounded. But alive. The struggle didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as routine. Days became heavier. Nights grew longer. His life settled into a rhythm of exhaustion that no one noticed because it looked ordinary from the outside. He woke before sunrise, worked until his muscles ached, and returned home with just enough energy to sit in silence before starting again. This was the part no one applauded. There were no motivational speeches, no sudden breakthroughs. Just effort, slow, grinding, and lonely. While others rested, he practiced. While others celebrated small wins, he faced small failures. Each one stung, but none hurt as much as the fear that all of this might still lead nowhere. He failed more times than he could count. Some days, the failures were small mistakes he could fix, lessons he could learn from. Other days, they felt enormous, swallowing weeks of work in a single moment. He would sit there afterward, staring at the remains of his effort, wondering how many times a person was supposed to start over before it broke them. He learned to keep his disappointments quiet. When people asked how things were going, he said, "Fine." When they asked if he was making progress, he nodded. It was easier than explaining the weight he carried every day. Money became a constant worry. There were moments when he had to choose between what he needed and what he believed in. Practicality pulled at him relentlessly, reminding him that dreams didn't put food on the table. More than once, he thought about quitting for good. Late at night, when the world was asleep and his room felt too small, he sat with his back against the wall and let the doubt wash over him. His body was tired. His mind was tired. Even hope felt tired. What if this is all I'll ever be, he wondered. He imagined a future where nothing changed. Where he grew older with the same unfulfilled longing, explaining to himself why it hadn't worked out. That thought terrified him more than failure ever could. So he kept going. Not with confidence, but with discipline. Not with excitement, but with endurance. He learned to work through the fear instead of waiting for it to disappear. He showed up on days when motivation abandoned him completely. He learned that persistence didn't feel heroic, it felt boring, repetitive, and painfully slow. There were sacrifices no one acknowledged. He missed gatherings. Declined invitations. Watched friendships fade because he couldn't explain why he was always busy or always tired. Some people stopped calling altogether. It hurt, but he understood. Everyone else was moving forward in visible ways: careers, relationships, stability. His progress existed mostly in his mind. Still, there were moments, small, fragile moments that kept him alive inside. A day when something finally worked after countless failures. A sentence that came together perfectly. A quiet realization that he was better than he had been a year ago. No one celebrated those moments with him. He celebrated them alone, silently, afraid to give hope too much space. One night, overwhelmed and shaking with exhaustion, he broke down. He sat on the floor, head in his hands, tears slipping through his fingers. Not loud sobs, just the steady release of someone who had been holding everything in for too long. He didn't cry because he was weak. He cried because he had been strong for too long without rest. "I'm trying," he whispered into the darkness. "I really am." There was no answer. No sign. No reassurance. And yet, After the tears dried, something remained. Resolve. The kind that isn't loud or proud. The kind that simply refuses to disappear. He wiped his face, stood up, and returned to his work. Slowly. Quietly. Imperfectly. Not because he believed success was guaranteed, but because stopping felt like betraying the person he was becoming. He realized then that the struggle wasn't a detour. It was the path. Every long night, every failure, every moment of doubt was shaping him in ways success never could. It was teaching him patience, humility, and strength that couldn't be taken away. He wasn't winning yet. But he was no longer the boy who had been laughed at. He was someone who had endured. And though the world still didn't see him, though nothing had changed on the surface, something inside him had grown unbreakable. The turning point didn't arrive like a miracle. There were no loud announcements, no sudden applause, no moment where the world stopped and finally noticed him. If anything, it almost passed unnoticed, quiet and unremarkable, like everything else in his journey. It began with a small opportunity. So small that, at first, he nearly ignored it. He found it late one night, scrolling absent-mindedly, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Under normal circumstances, he would have skipped past it. It didn't promise success. It didn't guarantee recognition. It wasn't the kind of opportunity people dreamed about. But something made him pause. It was a chance, not a breakthrough, not a shortcut, just a door cracked open slightly. And after so many closed doors, that was enough. He hesitated. Doubt whispered, "You've tried things like this before. They led nowhere." Fear added, "What if you fail again? What if this only proves them right?" His cursor hovered over the screen for a long moment. Then he exhaled and clicked. He decided to treat this opportunity differently. Instead of rushing in with desperate hope, he approached it with quiet focus. He didn't expect it to change his life. He simply decided to give it his best without cutting corners, without rushing, without trying to impress anyone. He worked carefully, thoughtfully, honestly. Hours passed unnoticed. Days followed. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't driven by the need to prove himself. He was driven by something deeper, a respect for the work itself. There were still mistakes. He still doubted himself. But instead of stopping, he adjusted. Instead of quitting, he learned. He treated every setback as feedback, every flaw as something to refine rather than hide. When he finally submitted his work, he felt no rush of excitement. Only relief. "I did what I could," he whispered. And for once, that felt enough. Then came the waiting. Days passed with no response. Then weeks. His expectations stayed low, protecting him from disappointment. He returned to his routine, telling himself it was just another attempt among many. And then, one ordinary morning, his phone buzzed. He stared at the notification, unsure why his heart suddenly raced. The message was short, polite, almost casual. But it said yes. Not a dramatic yes. Not a life-changing yes. Just a simple acknowledgement that his work mattered, that someone had seen value in what he had done. He read the message again and again, afraid it might disappear. For a long time, he just sat there. The room felt the same. The walls hadn't changed. His circumstances hadn't magically improved. But inside him, something shifted, something subtle yet powerful. Validation. Not the kind that feeds ego. The kind that feeds belief. For the first time, someone who didn't owe him anything chose him. That one small yes led to another opportunity. Then another. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, momentum began to build. Each step forward was modest, but together they formed something real. He still struggled. He still worked long hours. He still doubted himself. But now, doubt had competition. Hope returned, not loud or reckless, but grounded. Cautious. Strong. People around him didn't notice at first. To them, nothing had changed. But he noticed. He carried himself differently. He spoke with a little more certainty. He stopped apologizing for wanting more. One evening, he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself, not because he looked different, but because he felt different. He was no longer just surviving. He was building. That night, he opened his old notebook again. The pages were worn, filled with struggle and persistence. He turned back to the first sentence he had written long ago. One day, they will understand. He smiled softly. Maybe that day was still far away. Maybe it would never come exactly as he imagined. But he realized something important. Understanding wasn't the goal anymore. Progress was. He wrote a new line beneath it. This is only the beginning. The turning point wasn't a single moment of success. It was the moment he realized he was finally moving forward, and that, no matter how slow, forward was enough. Years later, the boy who had once been laughed at stood in a room full of people who had once doubted him. The same room where voices had mocked his dreams, where skepticism had tried to crush his hope, now seemed almost surreal. The walls, the chairs, even the air, everything was the same, yet everything had changed. He didn't stand there to gloat. He didn't stand there to shame anyone. He stood there because, quietly and steadily, he had arrived. Not by proving them wrong, but by proving himself right. People looked at him with surprise. Some with admiration. Some with the uncomfortable realization that they had underestimated him. A few remembered the laughter that had once filled this space and lowered their gaze, unsure what to say. A voice from the back finally broke the silence. How did you do it? He smiled gently, the kind of smile that comes from peace rather than pride. It wasn't easy, he said, his voice calm but steady. There were nights I wanted to give up. There were moments when the world told me I wasn't enough. But I kept going. I didn't stop believing in myself, even when no one else did. He paused, letting the words settle. Some faces softened. Some eyes glistened. The truth, he continued, is that I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it because I couldn't live with proving myself wrong. The room was quiet, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt respectful. Reflective. In the following months, the recognition that had once seemed impossible became a part of his life, not the kind that changes who you are, but the kind that acknowledges what you've built. Every opportunity, every success, every nod of approval was a testament to years of persistence, not luck. He thought about the early days often. The laughter that had once stung so sharply. The endless nights filled with doubt. The constant questioning of whether he was foolish or brave. He realized those moments had shaped him more than any applause ever could. They had taught him resilience, patience, and the quiet strength that comes from refusing to surrender. Even now, when he looked at people chasing their dreams, he remembered the fear, the exhaustion, and the loneliness. And he understood that encouragement was powerful, but persistence was indispensable. At a small gathering one evening, someone asked, "Do you ever think about giving up?" He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yes. Every single day," he admitted. But giving up was never an option, not really. It was easier to keep trying than to live with the regret of not trying at all. Later, when he was alone, he pulled out the old notebook, the one with creased pages and faded ink. The first page still read, "One day, they will understand." He traced the words with his finger, smiling. "They understood," he whispered. Not because he had sought approval, but because the journey had spoken for itself. He had learned something essential: the world may not always believe in you. People may laugh, doubt, and walk away. But if you hold on to your dream long enough, Work for it relentlessly, and believe in it quietly, it grows. Slowly, steadily, undeniably. And in the end, it proves itself. He closed the notebook and looked out the window at the city below. Lights twinkled like countless possibilities, like endless opportunities waiting to be taken. And for the first time, he felt fully at peace, not because the journey was over, but because he had lived it on his own terms. The boy who had once been mocked, doubted, and ignored had become a man who knew the truth. Success is not about proving others wrong. It's about refusing to be wrong about yourself. And with that knowledge, he smiled again, content in the quiet, powerful proof of his own persistence. The end. Seedling.